All right, y'all, we are back. Hope you all have had a wonderful day. It's been a long day for me. But we move. Anyway, I wanted to read a small portion of this article. This was published 20 years ago, written by Deborah Harley of University of Kentucky. And I really appreciate the way that she introduces this particular piece of work and the points that she makes. And it's really crazy because 20 years later, we're still having the conversation. Like, what? Of whether or not foundational Black Americans engage in, have created, have utilized intricate healing practices that are and should be considered indigenous for sure. And she kind of speaks to, why that is. But let me go ahead and just kind of read through this and then just this paragraph of the overview. Because like I said, we're going to shift gears, delving into these different healing practices and systems, which ones tend to be centered the most, and why bringing attention to. And forgive me, y'all, for some reason today I can't talk. I don't know if I'm still like in a slumber from the barbecue that I had earlier, which was the bomb, or and I'm still kind of in shock by the flavors and whatnot, or if I'm just tired. I don't know, y'all. But stick with me. Yeah, and so, we'll look into which ones are centered and shifting the focus and bringing more attention to maybe lesser known forms of healing and medicinal practice, ethnobotanical, ethnomedical practice among our people that was still very integral to our community and ethnogenesis or transformation on this land, and still went into informing what would build the very foundation of Western herbalism and even biomedicine that we see today. Okay, so we'll read this. So, indigenous healing practices among, and this word is gonna get me, y'all, rural. Say that 3 times fast. Exactly. Rural. Elderly foundational Black Americans. So elderly foundational Black Americans residing in rural areas have practiced and continue to practice indigenous healing practices for various reasons. In addition to the belief in the value of such practices, many of these individuals practice indigenous healing because it is cost effective. In this article, information is presented on the history of research on indigenous healing practices, theories, and models of indigenous healing in the United States, cultural influence, and views of healthcare providers regarding such practices. This article concludes with a discussion of the relevance of indigenous healing practices across disciplines and approaches, and recommendations of using participatory research as a means to understand indigenous healing practices among elderly foundational Black Americans. Introduction. The 21st century has begun with a continuous global health crisis, ergo AIDS, bird flu, drug abuse, malnutrition, and starvation, that threatens to incapacitate entire communities and countries. To respond to this crisis will require the biomedical community to access and harness as many resources and partners as possible. And even though some of these are still constant, what's unfortunate is that what is now included in this is inadequate care, culturally incompetent care, and life-threatening, quote-unquote, care that our community and people are subject to, especially the youth, elderly, and women, and men too. I don't ever want to exclude them. Men are amazing. We need them. They are important. I love the Black man. We should all have love for the Black man. And I think we live in a society that really seeks to worship and sort of idolize, really, and pedestalize the Black woman. And we see where, a lot of that psychology comes from out of Jim Crow. And again, that's not to take away from the Black woman and the importance of her role in our community, which is very pivotal, and our importance to life, right? But it's just a matter of framing things properly, putting things in their right perspective, and understanding and respecting what God has created, what the Most High God has designed, being a God of decency and order, and respecting that we are different creatures in a sense compared to our male counterparts. And that's okay. And that's a beautiful thing. It's not a matter of who's better. It's not a matter of who's more important. We both need one another. The children need us to need one another. Our elders need us to need one another, you know? And until we can really appreciate and respect that and humble ourselves to that, there will always be an attack on the Black, especially foundational Black American nuclear family. But anyway, not to start preaching on y'all. And so, yeah, unfortunately, this is expanded to include more with regard to, you know, the health systems themselves. And in many ways, it's by design. And so, you know, if anything, now more than ever is the time that we are to get back to these practices to preserve our communities. All right. To respond to this crisis will require the biomedical community to access and harness as many resources and partners as possible. Often overlooked and underestimated is the role of Indigenous healing or traditional medicine and healers, and the potential contribution they can make at various levels of healthcare delivery. Indigenous healing or traditional medicine refers to the practices and knowledge that existed before the advent of modern conventional medicine that were used to promote, maintain, and restore health and well-being. Indigenous knowledge represents that, or the accumulated experience, wisdom, and know-how unique to a given culture, society, and/or a community. It stands apart as a distinctive body of knowledge that has evolved over many generations in a particular ecosystem. Exactly. Our very ethnogenesis here on this land. The application of Indigenous healing includes designated helpers or healers within a culture who provide various forms of assistance, healing, and/or guidance to individuals who seek intervention for particular problems. In the United States, Indigenous healing practices are also referred to as traditional medicine, complementary and alternative medicine, and folk medicine. These Indigenous practices include everything ranging from herbal medicine and therapeutic touch to a prayer at a distance and faith healing. The purpose of this article is to describe Indigenous healing practices and cultural beliefs among rural, elderly, foundational Black Americans in the United States. Forgive me, y'all. Y'all know I'm trying to read slow. Let me slow down. Information is presented on this population with regard to A, an overview of the evolution of Indigenous healing practices and CAM. B, the history of research on Indigenous practices. C, theories, models of Indigenous healing in the U.S. D, current research on Indigenous healing practices. E, current techniques of Indigenous healing. F, cultural influences on the availability and use of Indigenous healing. G, views of Indigenous healing as a health service. And, which I'm really interested in that, H, the relevance of Indigenous healing practices across disciplines and approaches, and this as well. All right, so the reader is encouraged to review and analyze this information within the context of intracultural variation, generational metric. Okay, blah, blah, blah. All right, overview. So in the United States, I'm so happy someone has said this. Much of what is considered Indigenous healing practices is associated with, but not limited to, American Indians, which again, we've had to mention more distinction as it pertains to this particular title, Mexican, and Native Hawaiian cultures. So when people say Indigenous, this is what they're thinking about, namely red or white natives, quote unquote, Navajo, what have you. Mexican, a lot of healing traditions from South or Central America, which I know is not, just Mexican. And then Native Hawaiian cultures, Polynesian sort of situation, which is the same, right? That could be ignorance on my part. If Polynesia and Hawaii are different. I thought they were kind of similar. I need to do more research on that. Anyway, similar to previous mentioned groups, foundational Black Americans meet, you darn right we do, the definition of Indigenous peoples in several ways. First of all, foundational Black Americans have witnessed been excluded from, and have survived modernity and imperialism, and much worse. Second, they have experienced discrimination, isolation, and exclusion from participation as full citizens and colonialism of the modern historical period, beginning with the Enlightenment. I don't know. I think it was even before that, Miss Deborah. Third, they remain culturally distinct. Yes, we do. Yes, we do. With many of their native belief systems, still alive. Fourth, they survive outside their traditional lands, because they were forcibly removed from them and their connections. Gotta disagree with you here, because as we understand, foundational Black Americans make up more than the small percentage of those brought over from West Africa that would amalgamate and intermix with the Black Indigenous here, forming a new people and a new culture through that experience. Okay. And then finally, foundational Black Americans carry the label of a racial and ethnic minority. And I'm glad that she put that ethnic in there, because again, very important. Very important. Now, if we want to get technical, African American is a valid descriptor for first generation immigrants, for those who truly are continental African with American citizenship, right? So that applies to them, but they're a completely different ethnic group, even though they may share in the same racial category. Foundational Black Americans, completely different ethnic group, even though we may share in the same racial category. Think of all of the people who identify as white in this country, but are Hispanic, are Irish, are German, are Russian, are whatever. Insert here, right? All right. Let's see. I don't think I want to delve into all of this too much right now. And I definitely agree with this. And I mean, this would have been perfect if she would have just simply said, as a result of a portion of their ancestors' relocation to the New World, and those indigenous to the land, their displacement in what would become the New World. Again, a lot of and then this is from 20 years ago, so we get it, right? But that's kind of a part of the work that I'm setting out to do, is correcting the record, allowing it to be more holistic and accurate, and again, shedding light on and shifting focus to still honoring and respecting a lot of these systems that have preserved, that have been preserved by our people and have preserved our people, and many others, but also incorporating the unsung heroes, actors, and practitioners of knowledge, especially that tied to scripture and the word of God, for his medicines from the earth. And so, yeah, I think it very, very important, because what tends to happen, as we see here, is an improper distinction is made between Indian and African, native to this land, and then what gets centered and connected to foundational Black American is only, African. And I'm really starting to delve more into what the nature of servitude and slave enslavement was like, because sometimes there are distinctions between those terms. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, and sometimes they're both used in the same sentence or descriptor of a particular population, person, or group of people, like slaves in servitude. you know, um, though that can sometimes look different, oftentimes it really did not. And then you got to kind of question, like, well, what makes it different, and how what is that subject to, what context, and how are we defining that in relation to whatever we're discussing, right? Important questions to ask. But anyway, like I was saying, I'm really focused on understanding more about the nature of and the dynamics at play on the continent of Africa, when a lot of these nation states, tribes, chiefdoms, what have you, in these regions were profiting from the enslavement and then the sale of prisoners of war, and many of the people that would come over becoming a part of our heritage, ancestry, and lineage here. Because I do believe that we really need, to start understanding what cultural elements were prevalent and how those elements really impacted and were ingrained into those people's ways of life. Because when you really think about prisoners of war, for example, they weren't allowed to really incorporate with the natives of that particular region and the customs and cultures that they would observe. So in a sense, they almost had to kind of create their own, pulling in some of the elements around them, but almost having an ethnogenesis even through that experience, in a way of making something unique based on what they were going through and the circumstances. And then how that would be passed on, if that even would be passed on, depending on the time frame, if they were, if they intermarried and mixed, they were allowed to have children, if those children stayed with them. I mean, there's so many things at play. And so it's like, I think even our understanding of what cultural elements were prevalent among those who would be sold is even very foggy and convoluted and misunderstood often. And I think a lot of the customs and cultural elements tend to be indicative of what's in practice today as the result of a lot of these new nations coming to be. Does that make sense? So like, most of the countries right now in Africa were formed some in the late 1800s, a lot in the early 1900s. I mean, fairly new. Like, it's kind of crazy when you think about it, because it does feel like or seem as though it's been longer than that. But a lot of these people having been displaced themselves and moved around, and there's still a lot of slave trading going on over there now, like till this day, till this very moment, with Arabic nations and stuff like that. And there have been 3 other forms of slave trade prior to transatlantic slave trade, and with the, building up of these European powers. But yeah, I mean, there's so much that has changed in a short period of time, and also a very long period of time. Multiple things can be true at once, right? And so with understanding that, again, and with the way that we assign nations, people responsible for certain customs that came over, I just think that there needs to be more questioning around everything we've been taught and what we think we know, to either prove ourselves right or wrong, But I think it's worth taking on the journey of that discovery. Because if solidifying and not questioning this information is really a way to co-sign harm to our people, to indigenous people, that ain't right. No, that ain't right. So yeah, I guess I'm finna do it and be the only one doing it. I doubt I'm the only one doing it. I hope not. Lord have mercy. Somebody else do it with me now. Come on now. This is important stuff. To me it is. Really, really important. But yeah, so I'm interested in going through this and understanding more. Because when you even think about like a lot of the cloth, a lot of the traditions, a lot of the significance and meaning of like cowrie shells, for example, and other things like, excuse me, y'all. The meaning of those things and the significance of those things have shifted so much, especially once it came over yonder, you know? And when we understand that a lot of the cloth, like kente cloth and stuff like that, really isn't from Africa, and it's like this Europeanized, I don't know, like adulteration of, you know, native clothing or whatever. I'm at a loss for words right now, y'all. It's late, but y'all get what I'm saying. It's not what we thought it was, and a lot of what was, a lot of what we were sold really is tied deeply into Pan-Africanism, and for those of us tapped in, we kind of know what that's about. You know what I'm saying? So, yeah, it's unfortunate, but it's just like, again, we got to study to show ourselves approved, as the Word of God says. And a part of that, you know, starts with asking questions. And you really got to step back and look at the people who get very offended and upset and lash out when you ask questions, when you challenge something. You know, when you seek to validate something. I think that is very eye-opening. And it exposes a lot. And so, yeah. This is going to be good stuff. Super duper good stuff. Wow, lots of sources. Love it. All right, anyway. Y'all let me know what y'all think about this. Do you believe that foundational Black Americans should certainly have their own designation and title distinct from Indian, distinct from African American when it comes to Indigenous healing practices? Be sure to like, again, comment, let me know your thoughts, subscribe, and share. And thank y'all for tuning in. Be blessed.